September 1983 arrived in the village of Nizhnye Klyuchi, so generous and gentle that locals celebrated the weather around the clock as they harvested unprecedented crops from their fields. The entire valley, surrounded by gentle ridges and dense Siberian taiga, was literally bursting with abundance. Heavy, succulent heads of cabbage barely fit into carts. Sacks of onions as large as choice potatoes piled up outside every barn, and so much fodder for the livestock had been mown that it towered above the roofs of the huts. The chairman of the local collective farm, Zarya, proudly reported on the fulfillment of 3-year plans, and the village men gathered on their porches in the evenings, joking, making plans for the coming spring, and anticipating a well-fed, lazy winter. Carelessness reigned everywhere. People were in no hurry to bury their root vegetables deep in the ground, leaving them in shallow wooden outbuildings and semi-basements. The gentle sun continued to warm the earth. Apparently, it wasn't late September, but the height of a warm August. In this atmosphere of general triumph and relaxation, only one person in the entire village didn't share the general joy and surprise, and then the outright ridicule from his neighbours. 52-year-old Matvey Petrovich, whom everyone in the village called simply Grandpa Matvey, respectfully or with a slight Russian slur, spent his days in strange and grueling labour. A former frontline engineer and sapper who had served throughout the war and lost 3 fingers on his left hand while clearing a mine crossing, he proved to be remarkably inquisitive, with a penchant for trusting only easy facts and considering omens, not the bravura reports of radio receivers. While the neighbours celebrated and relaxed, Matvey Petrovich toiled in his vast vegetable garden from dawn to dusk. But instead of enjoying the gigantic root fruits, he gloomily examined each dug-up bush, measured the groundwater level, and squatted for long periods, pressing his bare palm to the parched soil. His old back, covered with internal wrinkles, bent under the weight of the sacks. But he was not heading with them to the spacious, substantial home cellar that his father had built before the revolution, on the very edge of his plot, where, among the thickets of thorny burdock and wild raspberries, the mouth of an old, abandoned well loomed black. This well has long had a bad reputation in Nizhnye Klyuchi, a completely useless structure that everyone tried to forget about 30 years ago. It was dug in ancient times, drilling a deep shaft through the rocky limestone layers of the hill. But the water proved too hard, with a bitter iron taste, and it had been gradually reduced after land reclamation in the valley and the change in the course of a forest stream. Since then, the dilapidated log structure above it has rotted and collapsed, and the hole itself, descending vertically for almost 12 meters, has become a dangerous pit that State Farm tractor drivers avoided to protect the plugs. The men had repeatedly advised Matvey Petrovich to simply fill the hole with construction waste or old logs, so as not to take up space on the ground. But the old man merely shook his head silently and continued to mow the grass around the upper openings, as if he were guarding some place, a secret known only to him. The real surprise, which grew into genuine indignation among the neighbours, began in early October, when Matvey Petrovich drove an old collective farm mare to the well, pulling a cart piled high with carefully dried, selected potatoes. Instead of carefully scattering the harvest into the warm wooden cellar of his house, where the walls were lined with dry straw and moss, the old man erected a massive wooden gate over the well, secured by a thick hemp rope and a fragile forged hook. Fellow villagers passing by his fence watched in amazement as Grandfather Matvey methodically lowered the fruits of his hard summer labour, bucket by bucket, into the dark, cold abyss of the abandoned mine. He acted without fuss, on purely German or military territory. Before lowering each bucket, he carefully sprinkled it with dry pine needles and river sand, carefully checked the knots on the rope, and listened for a long time to the sounds coming from the source, apparently leading the ocean with the most subterranean firmness. At first, it wasn't you who restrained your closest neighbor, 40-year-old Stepan Gordeev, who worked as the chief mechanic at the state farm and considered himself a man of progressive, strictly scientific views. Stepan approached the fence, leaned on a heavy rake and, with a loud laugh, called out to the old man, asking if he was hiding Napoleon's treasure in the rusty dampness, or if he'd simply decided to feed the underground devils with the farm's best potato variety. Matvey Petrovich, without even turning his head at this outburst, merely carefully secured another knot on the gate, wiped the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his old flannel shirt, and quietly but clearly announced that the ground was bone dry. The birds had flown away 3 weeks early, and the anthills in the forest had grown taller. Stepan merely waved his hand dismissively, dismissing the veteran's words as old wives' tales, and declared that television had promised a mild, moderate winter, and that the state farm warehouses were equipped with modern coal-fired stoves capable of withstanding any of nature's vagaries, should they suddenly arise. However, Matvey Petrovich ignored everyone's arguments, and over the next 2 weeks moved, literally, his entire vegetable garden, down to the last stalk, into the abandoned well. Following the potatoes, along a 12-meter stretch, appeared sturdy wooden boxes filled with carrots layered on moss, sacks of onions and garlic, as well as large glass bottles of sunflower oil and barrels of sauerkraut, which the old man sealed tightly with wax. Rumors began to circulate in the village that the old sapper had completely lost his mind in his old age, as the basement of his own house remained completely empty, cold, and echoing, without a single jar of pickles or sack of grain. Even the chairman of the collective farm, meeting Matvey Petrovich in the store, twirled a pencil at his temple and half-jokingly offered to write the old man a referral to the district hospital if he continued burying his food in the rocky abyss, where, by all accounts, it would inevitably freeze from the underground dampness or turn to ice with the first November frosts. The old man merely listened to these attacks in silence, maintaining the stern, almost tragic calm of a man who knows for certain that discussions are futile when disaster is only weeks away. He remembered the cold winter of 42 near Rzhev, when the ground froze so hard that sapper shovels broke like glass toys, and the only units that survived were those who had the foresight to lower their depots below the critical freezing point. Having finished lowering the upper barrels of pickles, Matvey Petrovich sealed the mouth of the well with 3 light oak planks, laid a layer of thick roofing felt on top, covered it all with a meter-thick layer of dry peat, and compacted the earth firmly, turning the dangerous pit into a smooth, inconspicuous mound. The village of Nizhnye Klyuchi continued to live its cheerful, carefree life, unaware that this gentle autumn sun was only the last, deceptive trick of nature before the onset of the most terrible climatic nightmare on the brink of history. By mid-October, the gentle autumn warmth that had lulled Nizhnye Klyuchi had vanished literally overnight, giving way to a heavy, leaden sky that hung low over the Tiger ridges. The wind shifted to a sharp northerly gust, bringing a wave of dry, biting cold from the Arctic Ocean, instantly withering and blackening the remaining grass in the meadows. The villagers, who had been wearing light, open jackets just the day before, hastily pulled heavy sheepskin coats from their chests and began to seal the cracks in their barns. But no one panicked, as the first frosts in Siberia are a common occurrence, even a welcome one. The men on their porches continued to chuckle at Grandfather Matvey, whose document and chilled house now seemed a monument to an old man's stubbornness and eccentricity. The same Matvey Petrovich, not paying attention to the whispers behind his back, went out every morning to his piled-up peat hill, carefully straightened the roofing felt leaves, and gazed, for a long time, into the grey pre-dawn haze, as if mentally calculating the invisible hands of a small, gigantic natural mechanism. His seasoned engineer's eye noticed how ordinary collective farmers passed by with complete indifference, relying on the weather reports from the local newspaper. The old man saw that the ground, practically dry from the autumn rains, had become a grey powder and was deeply cracked. Dry, dehydrated soil, as the seasoned engineer knew, retains its ability to retain heat and freezes several times faster and deeper than wet, compact soil. Large forest birds, usually gathering in noisy stands on the edges of the fields until November, suddenly disappeared, as if blown away by a hurricane. Petrovich's domestic geese and ducks had been trying to burrow deep into the straw since early morning, refusing to come to the feeders. All these small, disparate details coalesced in the veteran's mind into one clear and terrifying picture of an impending catastrophe, against which the ordinary, carefree village had no defence other than their vaunted but shallow cellars. On October 24th, the first real frost hit, but this wasn't the usual Siberian frost, bringing fluffy, life-saving snow that covers the ground like a warm blanket. The sky remained clear, deep and cold, and by midnight the temperature plummeted to -25°C. The ground, unprotected even by a thin layer of snow, met this blow naked, and a strange, frightening rumble echoed throughout the valley, the dry rock on the hillsides cracking from the sudden cold. Stepan Gordeev, returning late one evening from the State Farm garage, was surprised to find the wheels of his heavy Belarus tractor rolling down the dirt road at dawn, making a resonant sound as if on asphalt, and the iron tracks were throwing up not clods of dirt, but small, sharp fragments of petrified clay. The next day, the first unpleasant conversation took place at the Zarya Collective Farm office, causing the chairman to frown for the first time and recall the old sapper's strange explanations. The agronomist filed a report stating that the temperature in the shallow storage bins, where tons of the State Farm's beets and carrots were stored under a layer of straw and soil, had dropped below critical levels. The hastily constructed wooden outbuildings, which the chairman affectionately called our strategic reserve, began to succumb to the onslaught of the dry cold, letting icy air through invisible cracks in the siding. Stepan Gordeev, summoned to an emergency meeting, merely waved his hand confidently and ordered the activation of 2 additional corner furnaces in the warehouses, assuring management that the equipment could handle any onslaught of the elements, and that this early frost was merely a temporary anomaly, arriving with the first clouds. At this point, Matvey Petrovich descended into his basement to conduct a routine temperature check, as he always did during the international organization era. Inside the basement, the standard 1.5 meters deep for these parts, it was clean, dry, and ominously cool. The meager thermometer hovered at just 2°C, even though real winter hadn't even begun. The old man pressed his ear to the log foundation and heard the barely audible rustle of the freezing earth deep beneath the floor, gripping the roots of ancient trees in its icy grip. This was a sure sign that the cold had begun its swift and inexorable march deep into the earth's crust, devouring centimetre by centimetre into the very space people consider safe. The old man went upstairs, brewed a strong tea from dried currant leaves, and sat by the window, watching the bustle in his neighbour Stepan's yard. The mechanic's sons were hastily hauling boxes of onions from a leaky shed in the front porch. Passing Petrovich's house with another load, Stepan stopped, spat on the frozen ground, and shouted with feigned confidence that his supplies were already warm, bundled between the double log walls, while his grandfather's potatoes in the well had probably already turned to icy baldness. Matvey Petrovich said nothing, only quietly closing the window, realizing that the true depths of Siberian fury hadn't yet even revealed their true face. The 2 meters of earth separating his well storage from the surface would soon become the difference between life and starvation. By the first week of November, the weather had finally shed its mask, transforming the area around Nizhnye Klyuchi into a lifeless polar desert. A cosmic cold, wafting from the darkest depths of the tundra, gripped the valley with a ferocity unmatched by even the oldest centenarians who lived out their days on stoves. Daytime temperatures stabilized at -30 degrees, and at night the mercury plummeted to 45 degrees, causing the logs in the walls of the huts to crack with a deafening, frightening sound like pistol shots. The most terrifying revelation was that not a single snowflake had fallen. The sky remained deathly clear, cool, and starry, allowing the planet's entire accumulated geothermal energy, accumulated over the summer, to escape unchecked into outer space. The fluffy white blankets on the ground were exposed to the deadly blow, and the protected front began its inexorable vertical advance into the depths of the Earth's crust, destroying everything in its path. A veritable, panicked underground war broke out at the Zarya State Farm to save socialist property, whose management had so carelessly remained in the above-ground storage facilities. The 2 additional corner furnaces that Stepan Gordeyev had so proudly installed in the central vegetable storage facility were operating at their limits, devouring scarce fuel by the ton, but their heat was woefully inadequate. The warehouse walls, extending only a meter below ground, froze completely within the first 3 days, and a palm-thick layer of ice covered the inner brick slab, turning the room into a gigantic freezer. Tractor drivers and laborers, taking turns around the clock, tried to pry apart the frozen, stone-hardened piles of cabbage and beets with crowbars, but the vegetables shattered under the impacts like glass spheres, leaving behind only useless, frozen crumbs. The collective farm chairman, pale and haggard from lack of sleep, personally kept watch at the warehouse, watching in horror as the fruits of a year's labor of hundreds of people turned into an icy monolith. In the village itself, the living situation was no less tragic, as the traditional peasant cellars and basements, which had served faithfully for centuries, proved utterly powerless against the anomaly. Stepan Gordeyev, who only a week ago had laughed at Grandpa Matvey, now tried with fierce desperation to salvage the remains of his household. The cold had penetrated the massive pine foundation of his 5-walled house and begun to devour the potatoes right through the double wooden flooring, filling the entryway with the heavy, sweet smell of dense root vegetables rotting from frostbite. Stepan, along with his wife and sons, spent the night dragging heavy, otherwise covered sacks around the living rooms, blocking passageways and stacking boxes near the heated Russian stove. But space in the kitchen was desperately short, and the temperature at the very floor still dropped to freezing. Matvey Petrovich maintained an almost military-like calm these days, strictly following the instructions that had once saved his engineering battalion in the frozen swamps near Rzhev. Every evening he descended to his empty cellar, where the mercury on his old engineer's thermometer had already dropped to -3 degrees Celsius, confirming that the surface layer around the house had finally turned into dead ground ice. But the old man didn't panic. His main strategic citadel lay outside, at the edge of the vegetable garden, where a deep, rocky pit lay dormant under a thick layer of peat and roofing felt. Matvey Petrovich knew that, due to its ability to absorb surface temperature fluctuations, the rocky bedrock retained a constant, stable thermocortex, accumulated as a balance over a distance of 10 meters, and this natural thermos was now functioning without its usual malfunctions. In mid-November, exhausted from the struggle to keep his farm afloat, Stepan stepped out onto the porch for a smoke and saw Matvey Petrovich calmly chopping wood in his shed, wearing a light padded jacket and an old fur hat with ear flaps. The mechanic, his hands covered in chapped skin from constant work in the freezing cold, approached the fence and, hiding his eyes in shame, quietly asked the old man if he truly wasn't worried about his supplies buried in the abandoned mine. Matvey Petrovich slammed his axe into a massive larch block, turned to his neighbor, and calmly replied that panic is an engineer's worst enemy, and that physics and nature cannot be fooled, no matter how many furnaces you stoke above ground. The old man added that the village's trials were only just beginning, because the ice had already penetrated more than a metre into the ground, and soon the wells throughout the area would begin to close one after another, cutting people off from the last living waters. On November 20th, Siberia finally proved it's not to be trifled with. TV forecasts don't hold up even to a newspaper page. Nizhnye Klyuchi was hit by a so-called black blizzard, a rare and terrifying taiga phenomenon, when hurricane-force winds sweep across the ground at minus 50 degrees Celsius, minus 122 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, bringing no snow, merely scraping off the dry topsoil, swirling thick clouds of icy dust into the atmosphere. The air became so thick and prickly that it was physically impossible to walk outdoors without a wool scarf tied up to your eyes. Your lungs instantly burned, and your eyelashes froze into a single icy crust within minutes. But the most terrifying event occurred beneath people's feet, in the absolute confines of the Earth's depths, where the monstrous, unnatural cold continued to move vertically, like a giant hydraulic press. The ground in the valley had already frozen to a depth of 1.5 meters, turning into a monolithic, ringing slab that completely refused to let in any warmth. The first real disaster came to the country from where it was least expected, from the village wells, which had for centuries supplied Nizhnye Klyuchi with the purest groundwater. Because the typical drinking wells in the village rarely exceeded 4 or 5 meters in depth, the ice front reached the water-bearing residential buildings and, within hours, sealed them with a light, impenetrable bolt. Stepan awoke at 3 in the morning to a strange, dull, grinding sound coming from the street, and when he ran out to his well with a lantern, he was stunned. The massive oak rings of the log house had been compressed by expansion ice so much that they had cracked, turning the entire inner shaft into a solid column of ice. Within a couple of days, the village was left without a drop of drinking water. This was the reason for chopping up the dead ice on the Taiga River with axes, carrying it in buckets to the huts and heating it in the stoves, wasting precious dry firewood for this hour, which was now worth its weight in gold. At the Zarya State Farm, the finale of an actor's drama called Battle for the Harvest was unfolding. The furnaces in the central vegetable storage facility, which Stepan had been trying to stock with the best coal, couldn't withstand the 24-hour load. One of the main boiler's cast iron jackets cracked under the extreme strain. Ice rushed into the warehouse, and overnight, tons of food and carrots froze to their very foundations, turning into monolithic grey boulders that are now only thrown out in the spring. The chairman of the collective farm, looking on at this devastation, sat in his office in a sheepskin coat and hat, clutching his head in his hands. He didn't care that the state farm was ruined, and 4 months of brutal winter lay ahead, leaving nothing to feed the livestock on the farms or the people at the office. The situation at Stepan Gordeyev's home was no better. His spacious basement, where just a month ago neat rows of pickled jars had stood, had finally capitulated to the elements. The thermometer in the kitchenette read just 2 degrees Celsius, and the open cellar lid blew such a chill it felt like the open-air branch of a polar station. All the potatoes, which the mechanics had so painstakingly managed to cover with straw, had turned into slippery, sweetish ice cubes, and the glass jars of cucumbers and jam had burst from the frozen liquid inside, mixing the delicacies with transparent shards of glass. Stepan's wife quietly wept by the stove, wrapping the children in 3 blankets. The mechanic himself, angry and blackened with impotence, twisted an empty glass in his hands, realizing that his vaunted scientific training had been nothing in the face of the true Siberian fury. At that very moment, Grandfather Matvey was calmly going about his chores, strictly following his sapper's routine and not allowing even a single wisp of wind into the hut. Throwing on a heavy sheepskin coat, the old man grabbed a clean bucket and a heavy crowbar and leisurely made his way through the black-dusted garden toward his abandoned well, which neighbours had long considered a sign of his madness. Matvey Petrovich carefully peeled back the top layer of insulation, removed the roofing felt, and lifted the heavy oak block covering the mouth of the deep stone shaft. From the dark opening, extending 12 meters down into the frosty valley, a thick, dense stream of unexpectedly soft, moist, and genuinely warm air suddenly appeared, instantly melting the frost on the veteran's beard. The old man lit an old kerosene bat lamp and lowered it smoothly into the well mouth using a sturdy rope, peering carefully through the viewing window into the stone opening. There, at the very bottom, thanks to a 2-meter layer of permafrost, the rocky limestone maintains its pristine, deep-level temperature of a stable 4 degrees Celsius. The lamp illuminated neat, dry wooden boxes containing potatoes, sprinkled with pine needles and sand, a perfect bed, untouched by a single drop of frost. Barrels of cabbage stood unshaken, as if in the finest factory thermos. Matvey Petrovich chuckled with satisfaction, lifted a bucket of choice, large tubers up, and locked the oak bolt of his underground ark, knowing that while the entire village of Nizhnye Klyuchi was slowly plunging into icy chaos, his small engineering fortress was working from the outskirts of the Kremlin chimes. By the first year, the ground in Nizhnye Klyuchi had frozen to a record depth of 2 meters. This icy shell, completely impenetrable to ordinary crowbars and picks, completely paralyzed life in the village, turning every step down the street into a struggle for basic survival. The state farm was left without running water, and unstable milkmaids, along with tractor drivers, manually chopped ice from a taiga stream to save the breeding cows from thirst. Gloom reigned in the collective farmers' homes. The chilly cellars smelled of rot and dampness, and the meager vegetable supplies that people tried to preserve in kitchen ovens quickly spoiled from the constant temperature fluctuations. All my carefree spirit and pride as a collective farm chairman evaporated like morning fog, giving way to the harsh realization that the village found itself on the brink of a current food catastrophe at the very beginning of a protracted Siberian winter. Stepan Gordeyev sat in his kitchen, gloomily gazing at the pile of sweetish, wrinkled salad his wife had been planning for lunch. The potatoes, frozen in the shallow cellar, were boiling down into a sticky, tasteless mess, which the children ate with obvious reluctance and tears in their eyes. The mechanic felt utterly crushed. His vaunted technical education, his knowledge of tractor engines and state-owned heating systems were completely useless in the face of this primal, natural fury. Passing the window, he once again noticed Grandpa Matvey calmly strolling through his yard, carrying a full bucket of clean, dry, and, by all appearances, perfectly healthy carrots, their juicy stems jutting out cheerfully in all directions. Shame and pride battled for a long time in the 40-year-old mechanic's soul, but the sight of freezing children and empty pots outweighed all former ambitions. Stepan watched with a heavy gaze, slung a heavy sheepskin coat over his shoulders, and slowly trudged over the snow-covered fence to his neighbour's property, reproaching himself for every insulting word he had so thoughtlessly hurled at the veteran of the previous autumn. He found Matvey Petrovich in the warm entryway, where the old man carefully catalogued root vegetables in small birch-bark boxes for daily use. Stepan paused at the threshold, shifting hesitantly from foot to foot, removed his fur hat, and quietly, averting his eyes, said he had come to apologize for his stupidity and arrogance, because his small cellar had frozen to the ground and his family was left without their standard sack of healthy food. Matvey Petrovich wasn't even surprised by this visit. His stern face remained calm, and his intelligent, world-weary eyes held not a hint of malice or arrogance. The old man silently directed his neighbour to a wooden bench by the stove, poured a large mug of hot lingonberry tea, and calmly replied that in war, and in the taiga, pride always perishes first, and the earth does not forgive mistakes, especially those who have learned to read its signs. Matvey Petrovich didn't lecture or reproach the mechanic for his past mistakes. Instead, he pulled from a closet an old, tattered notebook containing the blueprints of his sapper battalion from the Great Patriotic War. He placed the notebook on the table in front of Stepan and began drawing a line with a pencil, explaining to the mechanical engineer the fundamental laws of underground thermal insulation, which the state farm builders had somehow chosen to forget. The old man explained that a rigid, deadly boundary between the Arctic cold surface and the deep warmth of the Earth's crust now lay just 2 meters below. Everything above this level was doomed to destruction, but his abandoned well extended down almost 12 meters, penetrating the limestone slabs of the hill to a constant ground temperature. In this area, securely sealed by the upper meters of dry peat and roofing felt, the Earth acted as a gigantic theoretical radiator, maintaining a stable 4 degrees of heat, regardless of whether a 50-degree snowstorm raged above. Stepan listened to these explanations with his mouth open, suddenly grasping the ingenious simplicity and mathematical precision of the old man's calculations, which saved the harvest despite all the vagaries of the Siberian climate. Following his explanation, Matvey Petrovich rose from the bench, picked up a sturdy leather belt with a light-forged carabiner, and ordered Stepan to follow him to the edge of the garden, where a peat mound towered beneath the black snowstorm. Together, the men pushed aside the heavy roofing felt, and when the old man lifted a massive oak block, Stepan saw with his own eyes what the village had refused to believe for 2 months. From the depths of the abandoned mine, thick, humid steam billowed into the frosty sky of Nizhnye Klyuchi, smelling of dry pine needles, river sand, and ripe, healthy potatoes. At the very bottom of the well, where they had poured out a kerosene lamp, stood neat rows of untouched, frost-covered boxes containing tons of choice food, ready to feed more than one family throughout the long, harsh winter. By December 10th, the situation in Nizhnye Klyuchi had reached a breaking point, and it was no longer possible to conceal the food disaster in front of the district centre. At an emergency meeting of the board of the Zarya Collective Farm, the chairman, hiding his eyes from the angry crowd, officially acknowledged that the central warehouse had been completely destroyed by the ice sheet, and the remaining livestock on the farms would soon have to be slaughtered due to a lack of feed and drinking water. The men in the hall were noisy, and the women wept openly, realizing that a long, hungry, and dark winter lay ahead, with no hope of help from the city, as all roads into the district were completely blocked by heavy taiga snowdrifts. In this stifling atmosphere of general despair, Stepan Gordeyev suddenly rose from his seat, leaned his hands heavily on the wooden table, and loudly, for the whole hall to hear, declared that in the village there was a man who had outsmarted nature itself, and who right now had several tons of fresh potatoes stored away, untouched by a single drop of frost. The mechanic's words struck the hushed hall like an exploding shell, and within half an hour, a huge, noisy crowd of collective farmers, led by the pale chairman and party organizer, stood at the boarded-up gate of Matvey Petrovich's house. They whispered fearfully and hopefully, peering into the empty, chilled basement of the old man's house. But Stepan confidently led them all into the very depths of the garden, where, amidst the dead burdock thickets, the dark mound of an old abandoned well, covered in roofing felt and peat, loomed. The chairman, in disbelief, approached the edge of the shaft, and when, at his request, Matvey Petrovich calmly pushed back the massive oak shutter, thick, warm, and moist steam, scented with dry pine needles and ripe earth, once again erupted from the deep 12-meter-long stone shaft into the frosty village air. A kerosene lamp hastily lowered on a rope illuminated at the very bottom the perfect neat rows of wooden boxes in which, as if in a secure safe, rested the entire gigantic autumn harvest of the veteran sapper. The crowd stood for a moment in reverent, stunned silence, comprehending the full depth and mathematical precision of the old man's calculation, which only a month earlier they had dismissed as madness and senile dementia. The collective farm chairman slowly removed his expensive sheepskin hat, bowed low, from the waist to the silent Matvey Petrovich, and in a low, trembling voice asked the veteran to save the village and allocate at least some of the supplies for the kindergarten and the most impoverished families. The old man cast a stern, penetrating glance at his hushed fellow villagers, including those who had laughed loudest at him outside the village store, sighed, and calmly replied that his well-draining ark had been built not for pride, but to save lives, and therefore the supplies would be divided equally among all the houses with small children. The entire following week in Nizhnye Klyuchi turned into a tightly organized military operation to evacuate food supplies from the underground citadel, personally commanded by Matvey Petrovich, drawing on his old frontline skills. Stepan Gordeyev, along with the sturdy men from the state farm, stood guard around the clock at the gate, carefully lifting heavy buckets of large, firm potatoes, juicy carrots, and crates of onions from the 12-meter abyss. Right there, right by the well, the women wrapped the rescued root vegetables in several layers of warm blankets and carefully carried them on children's sleds to the chilled huts, where the frightened children finally saw a real, steaming, crumbly home-cooked dinner on the tables. Grandfather Matvey's abandoned well, long the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood, became, at the most critical moment in Nizhnye Klyuchi's history, the only source of life and salvation for hundreds of freezing people. The bitter -50°C frosts that gripped Siberia began to slowly recede only by mid-February, when a bright, spring-like sun finally rose over the hushed Nizhnye Klyuchi valley. The heavy ice sheet, which had frozen the ground to a record depth of 2 meters, thawed slowly and painfully, covering the country roads with deep, jagged wounds and turbulent mud flows. But by the time the last taiga snow melted, the village of Nizhnye Klyuchi was a completely different place. This harsh ordeal had forever changed the minds of the locals and forced them to reconsider their attitude toward age-old folk wisdom. Not a single soul in the village perished of starvation during that terrible winter, and all 320 inhabitants of the valley successfully survived until the first grass grew, thanks to the underground ark of a veteran sapper. In the spring, a new young chairman took over the Zarya collective farm, and Stepan Gordeyev, having completely reconsidered his views on life, officially assumed the position of chief engineer for civil defense and construction. The first project Stepan approved by the board was a detailed plan for a large-scale reconstruction of all food warehouses and private cellars in the area, taking into account Matvey Petrovich's unique experience. Under the careful guidance of the veteran sapper, 16 central storage facilities in Nizhnye Klyuchi were reconstructed and deepened over the summer, their lower tiers now extending well beyond the critical 2-meter mark of seasonal ground freezing. The old construction habit of relying on surface coal-fired furnaces was forever a thing of the past, giving way to precise, mathematically calibrated geothermal insulation capable of withstanding any climatic anomaly. Matvey Petrovich lived for another 13 years after that memorable winter, remaining a living legend for the entire region, an unquestioned authority and the taiga's foremost prophet, whose quiet words were heeded even by district officials. When grandfather Matvey passed away, people from all the surrounding villages and state farms flocked to his funeral. Hundreds of the men, women, and grown children he had saved, who tearfully carried the veteran's coffin through the village. His old, abandoned well, once a symbol of salvation, was carefully surrounded by a beautiful wrought-iron fence by new generations of collective farmers, turning it into a major historical monument to human foresight, resilience, and a profound understanding of the laws of nature. Even today, driving past the semi-abandoned village of Nizhnye Klyuchi, one can spot from afar a massive granite slab erected by local residents on the site of that legendary Petrovich well. Carved in gold letters on the dark stone, covered with a network of tiny cracks from time, are simple yet profound words that have become the main motto of these harsh places. Mathew's well, rejected by human pride as a sign of madness, recognized by the earth itself as the highest engineering wisdom for saving lives. The deep limestone shaft continues to this day, and the temperature at its bottom remains a steady 4 degrees Celsius, a reminder to all who live that nature never forgives carelessness. True human security and survival are born not from attempts to subjugate the planet by force or through bravura reports, but from the ability to hear the quiet voice of the earth in time, to read its ancient signs, and to build one's home in a strong, conscious union with eternity.